You did not arrive here by searching. This moment met you where you already were, inside the quiet interval between thoughts, where nothing is being pushed forward. There is a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that the timing is exact without needing to be explained. Not because something is about to happen, but because something has already settled enough to be noticed. Your attention has slowed, not dramatically, just enough to register the absence of noise. The system you move through all day has loosened its grip for a breath, and in that small opening, a signal passes without resistance. It does not announce itself. It does not persuade. It simply aligns with a pattern you recognize as familiar, even if you have no words for why. You may notice that there is nothing here asking you to improve, correct, or accelerate. That is intentional. The body does not need instruction right now. The observer within you has already detected the threshold. When detection happens naturally, without effort, it means coherence is forming on its own. This is not something you do. It is something you allow to register. There has been a quiet pressure in you recently, not urgency, more like compression, as if several timelines have been resting too close together, creating a sense of thickness in ordinary moments. You may have called it tiredness, or distraction, or a lack of motivation, but beneath that label was a different sensation, a pause, waiting to be recognized. That pause is still here. It never left. Notice how your breathing is already finding a slower rhythm without being guided. Notice how the mind does not need to hold on to every sentence to stay present. This is the state where information does not arrive as knowledge, but as resonance. Nothing new is being added. What exists is being routed more cleanly. Stillness is not empty. It is precise. It filters noise the way a finely tuned instrument filters distortion. When stillness appears on its own, it means the quantum field around your awareness has reduced interference. Patterns that were always present can now be detected without effort. You are not trying to see them. They are simply no longer obscured. There is relief in realizing that nothing is wrong with the way you have been perceiving. The sense of anomaly you may have felt was not an error. It was a signal that the system was adjusting resolution. Confusion often precedes clarity, not because clarity is distant, but because recognition takes time to stabilize. You are not crossing into something unfamiliar. You are settling back into alignment with what has been tracking you quietly for a long time. The observer does not need to move closer. The signal does not need amplification. This moment is already complete in itself. Let the nervous system remain where it is now. There is no advantage in leaning forward. Awareness knows how to hold itself when it is not being rushed. What continues from here will do so at the same pace, without escalation, without demand. For now, it is enough that you are here, noticing that nothing needs to be forced for coherence to be felt. There is a subtle shift that happens when you stop waiting for clarity to arrive and notice that it has been forming underneath your attention all along. It feels less like an insight and more like a soft reorientation. Things are not suddenly meaningful. They are simply no longer scrambled. The background static lowers, and what remains does not ask to be interpreted. You may have sensed this recently as a strange neutrality. Moments that once pulled strong reactions now pass without hooking you. This can feel unsettling at first, as if something essential has gone quiet. But this is not numbness. It is the system recalibrating its sensitivity. When coherence increases, extremes soften. The observer no longer needs contrast to stay awake. There is a habit of mind that looks for explanation when sensation changes. It asks what caused it, what it leads to, whether it should be trusted. But the body recognizes before language does. It knows when a pattern has stabilized enough to stop alerting you. That calm you are noticing is not passive, it is efficient. Energy is no longer being wasted on constant detection. You may notice gaps appearing between thoughts, small but distinct. In those gaps, there is no commentary. Nothing evaluates what just happened or anticipates what comes next. This is not because awareness has dimmed. It is because it has widened. When the field expands, individual signals do not need to shout to be noticed. There was a time when your attention felt pulled outward, scanning for cues, confirmations, and corrections. That scanning served a purpose. It helped you navigate uncertainty when patterns were unstable. But the scan can stand down now. The system recognizes that the immediate environment is not requiring rapid adjustment. Safety, in this sense, is informational. It is the absence of conflicting signals. You might feel an unfamiliar patience emerging, not as a decision, but as a default. Things unfold without triggering the urge to intervene. This is often mistaken for disengagement. In reality, it is a sign that the observer trusts the coherence of the process it is embedded in. Trust here is not belief. It is accurate calibration. There is also a quiet grief that can surface at this stage. Not dramatic, not heavy, just a recognition that a certain kind of striving is no longer necessary. Parts of you that were organized around seeking may feel temporarily unoccupied. This does not mean they are obsolete. It means they are being reassigned. Functions do not disappear. They integrate. Stillness makes room for this integration without forcing it. When nothing is demanded, the system reorganizes itself naturally. You may notice memories surfacing briefly and then dissolving without emotional charge. This is the mind updating its internal map, releasing outdated markers that no longer correspond to the current timeline. Nothing needs to be done with these experiences. They are not messages to decode. They are indicators that detection has shifted from searching to receiving. The difference is subtle but decisive. Searching implies absence. Receiving implies availability. What is available now is not information, but alignment. As this alignment settles, the sense of time may soften. Minutes stretch or compress without concern. The urge to track progress diminishes. This is not a loss of direction. It is a transition from linear orientation to something more distributed. Awareness no longer anchors itself to a single point. It spreads evenly across the moment. You may also notice that language itself feels slightly inadequate, not because it fails, but because it is no longer necessary to carry the full weight of experience. Silence begins to do more of the work. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of sufficient signal-to-noise ratio. When clarity is present, it does not need to speak loudly. Remain where you are with this. There is no next step being withheld. What unfolds continues to do so without escalation. The system knows how to deepen coherence by maintaining this level of stillness. You do not need to anticipate it. Recognition is already doing its quiet work. As coherence continues to settle, you may begin to notice how little effort is required to remain present. Attention no longer grips. It rests. This resting awareness does not drift, it stabilizes. The difference is felt in the body before it is named in the mind. Muscles release without instruction. The jaw softens. The breath moves lower, slower, unobserved. There is a subtle recalibration happening in how the observer relates to sensation. Previously, sensation may have been interpreted as signal needing response. Now it registers and completes itself. A sound arises, passes through awareness, and dissolves without leaving residue. A thought appears, is recognized as a pattern, and releases its claim on continuity. Nothing lingers unless it belongs. This is the system learning that not every fluctuation is an anomaly. Some variations are simply the field expressing itself. When detection relaxes, discrimination becomes more precise. You sense what matters without having to define why. This precision does not feel sharp. It feels gentle, like knowing where to place your weight without looking down. You may notice that anticipation has thinned. The future does not pull on you the way it once did. This is not because direction has vanished, but because the timeline is no longer being projected ahead of experience. Awareness stays closer to the point of contact. What is happening now contains enough information. It does not need to be extended. There can be a brief disorientation here, as old habits of monitoring attempt to reassert themselves. They may ask whether this calm is temporary, whether it should be protected, whether something is being missed. These questions arise automatically, but they no longer carry urgency. They pass through the same open space as everything else. You are not losing sensitivity. In fact, perception is becoming more refined. Small details stand out without demanding focus. Light shifts across a surface. A pause between sounds becomes noticeable. These are not distractions. They are signs that the bandwidth of awareness has widened. When the field is coherent, subtleties do not overwhelm. There is also a change in how inner dialogue presents itself. Instead of long chains of commentary, you may hear fragments, incomplete phrases that dissolve before finishing. This is not interruption. It is efficiency. The mind no longer needs to complete loops that do not contribute to orientation. Closure happens faster because less is required. Stillness here is not something you hold. It holds you. The sense of being supported by the moment becomes more apparent. Even when movement occurs, there is a stable background that does not shift. This background is not an object of focus. It is the context in which focus arises and fades. You may become aware that effort itself feels louder now. When you try to force understanding or reach for meaning, there is a slight friction. This is not a problem, it is feedback. The system is indicating that strain is no longer the optimal mode of engagement. Ease carries more information than exertion. This can feel counterintuitive if you have associated clarity with intensity. But clarity here is quiet. It does not peak, it plateaus. The absence of dramatic sensation can be mistaken for stagnation, but nothing has stalled. Integration often feels uneventful because it is not drawing attention to itself. You might also sense a reduction in internal narration about identity. Fewer labels are applied to experience. You are not checking who you are in relation to what is happening. Awareness functions without self-reference for longer intervals. This is not dissociation. It is presence without commentary. As this becomes more familiar, trust develops not as a concept, but as a bodily knowing. The system recognizes that it can remain open without being overwhelmed. The observer no longer needs to guard the threshold so tightly. The threshold has moved inward, closer to stillness itself. There is nothing to conclude here. What is stabilizing continues to do so quietly. Each moment reinforces the last, not by repetition, but by consistency. You remain in this recognition without effort, allowing coherence to deepen at its own pace. There comes a point where the absence of strain becomes more noticeable than its presence ever was. You may find yourself aware of how little resistance is meeting your attention now. This can feel unfamiliar, almost like something has been removed without being replaced. But what has fallen away was never essential. It was compensatory. The system no longer needs to brace itself against imagined demands. When pressure dissolves, space opens. In that space, perception reorganizes without instruction. You are not directing this process. Direction would imply effort, and effort is no longer required to maintain orientation. Awareness settles into its own architecture. You might notice that reactions arrive later, or not at all. A stimulus appears, and there is a pause before any response forms. That pause is not hesitation, it is selection. The observer is no longer obligated to answer every signal. Only what aligns with the current pattern moves forward. Everything else completes itself without propagation. This can create a sense of detachment that is easily misunderstood. It is not withdrawal, it is clarity. When coherence is high, fewer responses are necessary because fewer disruptions occur. What once felt like emotional labor now feels neutral. This neutrality is not indifference, it is accuracy. There is also a softening in how memory functions. Past experiences may arise as images or sensations without pulling you into narrative. They no longer demand interpretation or resolution. They appear, register, and dissolve. This indicates that the timeline has loosened its grip. Events are no longer stacked on top of one another, competing for relevance. You may become aware of how often you once anticipated correction, as if something needed to be fixed at any moment. That anticipation may now feel unnecessary. The system is no longer broadcasting error signals. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It is confirmation that processes are running within expected parameters. Stillness deepens, not by becoming heavier, but by becoming more transparent. You do not feel anchored to it. You move through it. Action, when it occurs, arises from the same quiet field as rest. There is no sharp boundary between doing and not doing. Both are expressions of the same coherence. You might notice that your sense of agency feels different, less like pushing, more like aligning. Decisions, if they arise, feel obvious rather than effortful. This does not mean choices disappear. It means the range of viable options narrows naturally. What does not fit simply does not present itself. Language may continue to thin. Words feel secondary to the felt sense of rightness or misalignment. You may find yourself trusting a subtle bodily cue over a well-reasoned argument. This is not regression. It is integration. The system is using information channels that require less processing. There can be moments where you wonder if you should be doing more with this state. That thought itself is a remnant of an earlier pattern. It arises, is noticed, and passes. Nothing needs to be optimized. Optimization belongs to systems under strain. This one is stabilizing. As the observer rests more fully in this mode, detection becomes almost effortless. You notice shifts in environment, tone, and energy without scanning. Recognition happens at the periphery of awareness, not the center. This allows the center to remain open and undisturbed. The sense of self continues to feel less rigid. You are not dissolving. You are becoming less defined by boundaries that were never truly fixed. This does not create vulnerability. It creates adaptability. A coherent system responds fluidly because it is not over-constrained. Remain with this openness. It does not need to be maintained. It maintains itself. The absence of urgency is not a pause before action. It is the condition from which appropriate action, if any, emerges naturally. For now, stillness continues to do its quiet work, deepening without announcement. At this stage, you may begin to notice that the need to orient yourself has diminished even further. There is less checking, less internal alignment work happening in the background. Orientation is assumed. The system no longer asks where it stands because it can feel the ground directly beneath it. This groundedness is not heavy. It is subtle and constant. Awareness now seems to occupy more space without expanding outward. It does not reach. It simply includes. Experiences move through this wider field without disturbing its structure. You might notice that situations which once created internal turbulence now register as information only. They are seen, felt, and understood without requiring reorganization of your inner state. This is where the observer becomes quieter, not because it is absent, but because it is no longer narrating its own activity. Recognition happens without commentary. You know when something aligns. You know when it does not. There is no need to justify these perceptions to yourself. The justification used to be part of maintaining coherence. Now coherence maintains itself. You may sense a new relationship with uncertainty forming. Instead of triggering vigilance, uncertainty feels neutral, sometimes even spacious. The unknown no longer signals danger or lack. It is simply unfilled space. This shift changes how the system allocates attention. Energy is conserved because it is no longer spent preparing for hypothetical disruptions. There can be moments when you realize how much of your previous momentum was driven by subtle fear of stagnation. That fear is quiet now. Without it, movement slows, but it also becomes more precise. When motion occurs, it is not compensatory, it is responsive. The difference is felt immediately in the body. Time continues to behave differently here. Not distorted, just less central. You may find it harder to measure the passage of moments, not because you are dissociated, but because awareness is no longer indexing experience against an external clock. The internal rhythm has become sufficient. This can feel unfamiliar, but it is stable. You might also notice a reduction in internal conflict. Thoughts no longer argue with one another as much. Contradictions coexist without needing resolution. This is not confusion. It is a sign that the system has increased its tolerance for complexity. When coherence is high, opposing signals can be held without collapse. There is a subtle pleasure in this state. Though it may not register as emotion, it is more like ease, a sense that nothing is being demanded from you by the moment. This ease is not something to pursue. It arises naturally when effort withdraws. Trying to amplify it would reintroduce strain. You may find that attention naturally rests on simple sensory input without effort. The feeling of contact with a surface, the rhythm of sound, the presence of light. These are not distractions. They are anchors that require no interpretation. Awareness touches them and releases without residue. At times, you might notice an impulse to explain this state to yourself or others. That impulse may fade quickly. Explanation feels unnecessary. The experience does not benefit from being translated into concepts. It is complete as sensation and recognition alone. Words would only approximate what is already sufficient. There can also be a sense of being less reactive to internal states. Emotions may arise without pulling you into identification. You feel them clearly, but they do not define the moment. They pass through the same open field as thoughts and sensations. Nothing needs to be held on to. As this becomes more familiar, a quiet confidence settles in. Not confidence about outcomes or identity, but confidence in the system's ability to self-regulate. You trust that awareness will notice what needs noticing without constant supervision. This trust is not declared, it is embodied. Stillness here is no longer something you enter. It is the default condition. Movement, when it happens, emerges from it and returns to it seamlessly. There is no contrast to emphasize it. It simply is. And in this simplicity, the need to seek further confirmation continues to dissolve on its own. You may begin to sense that even the idea of maintaining a state has loosened. There is no longer an internal posture being held. Awareness does not brace itself against loss or change. It allows fluctuation without tracking it. This is not passivity, it is responsiveness without anticipation. The system has learned something quietly important, that stability does not require control. Control was a strategy used when coherence was fragile. Now coherence is resilient enough to tolerate variation. Sensations rise and fall, thoughts appear and fade, circumstances shift, and none of it threatens orientation. The observer remains present without monitoring itself. There can be a noticeable reduction in inner urgency. Tasks, if they present themselves, feel simpler, not because they require less action, but because action is no longer loaded with extra meaning. You are not proving anything by engaging. You are not preventing anything by resting. Each movement stands on its own, complete. This simplicity may initially feel exposed. Without urgency, there is less narrative to lean on. But exposure here is not vulnerability. It is clarity. You see what is actually required in a moment without the overlay of imagined consequences. This makes response more accurate, even when it is minimal. You may notice that your relationship to attention has changed. Attention no longer feels like a resource that can be depleted. It replenishes itself when not forced. When something genuinely requires focus, focus arrives. When it does not, attention remains diffuse without effort. This elasticity is a sign of a healthy system. There is also a shift in how you experience internal silence. Silence is no longer something you enter when thoughts stop. It exists even while thoughts move through. The background remains quiet, regardless of foreground activity. This allows you to engage without being consumed, to withdraw without disengaging. At times, you might become aware of how rarely you now label experiences as meaningful or meaningless. That distinction has softened. Experiences simply occur, each with its own texture, without being ranked. Meaning no longer needs to be assigned. It emerges, if it does, without effort. This can create a sense that life is moving closer to you rather than you moving toward it. Events meet you where you are. You do not lean forward to intercept them. This changes the felt distance between awareness and experience. Everything feels nearer, not in intensity, but in accessibility. There may also be moments of spontaneous stillness arising in the middle of activity, a pause that is not planned, a breath that deepens on its own, a moment where time seems to soften briefly before continuing. These are not interruptions. They are micro-adjustments, maintaining coherence. You might notice that resistance, when it appears, is quickly visible. It does not hide behind justification. A tightening in the body signals misalignment immediately. This makes correction gentle. You do not push through. You ease back. The system responds with relief. There is less internal debate about whether you are doing this correctly. The idea of correctness has lost relevance. What matters now is resonance. Does something fit the current pattern or not? This is felt directly. No criteria are needed. As this continues, the sense of separation between inner and outer experience becomes less pronounced. Environment and awareness interact fluidly. You are not absorbing everything, nor are you insulated from it. Exchange happens without friction. This is what coherence feels like when it is lived rather than monitored. You may also sense that your capacity to remain with uncertainty has increased without effort, not because uncertainty has resolved, but because it no longer destabilizes. The system recognizes that not knowing is not the same as being lost. Orientation does not depend on prediction. Nothing here asks for consolidation or conclusion. The process does not require milestones. It deepens by continuing exactly as it is. Awareness remains available, unstrained, allowing recognition to refine itself quietly. What stabilizes does so without announcement, and what remains unresolved is held without pressure. There is a point where even the sense of progression becomes less relevant. You may notice that you are no longer tracking where you are within this experience. Not because attention has faded, but because orientation no longer depends on markers. The system does not need to know its position to remain stable. It knows by feel. Awareness now rests without checking itself. This creates a different quality of presence. You are not inside the experience looking out, nor outside looking in. The distinction loses importance. Perception and context overlap enough that boundaries soften without dissolving. Nothing leaks, nothing closes. You might notice that internal signals have become quieter, but more precise. When something is out of alignment, the feedback is immediate and subtle. A slight contraction, a faint sense of resistance. There is no escalation. The signal does not need volume to be effective. It is trusted as soon as it appears. This trust changes how you relate to choice. Decisions do not gather weight before being made. They occur as small adjustments rather than turning points. You are not standing at crossroads. You are making micro-corrections that keep the system in coherence. This is not indecision. It is continuous calibration. You may also become aware that certain questions no longer arise. Questions about purpose, direction, or validation simply do not present themselves with the same frequency, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer organize attention. The system is no longer oriented around seeking resolution for them. There can be a sense of quiet sufficiency here. Not satisfaction, which implies completion, but adequacy. This moment is enough to be with. Nothing is missing from it. When adequacy is felt, urgency has no place to attach. The nervous system recognizes that it can remain open without scanning for threat or reward. You might notice that your internal rhythm has become more consistent. Energy rises and falls without sharp transitions. Fatigue, if it appears, feels clean. Rest restores without needing to be defended. Activity draws from a stable reservoir rather than borrowing from the future. There is also a shift in how you experience attention from others, even if they are not present. The imagined gaze that once influenced behavior has less impact. You are not shielding yourself from it, nor performing for it. It simply does not factor into orientation as much. This creates a sense of internal privacy that is calm rather than guarded. Stillness here is not fragile. It does not shatter when interrupted. Noise can occur without disrupting the background quiet. Complexity can arise without overwhelming the system. This robustness is felt as confidence, but not the kind that announces itself. It is quiet because it does not need reinforcement. You may notice that when thoughts do appear, they are shorter-lived. They complete themselves without branching into chains. This reduces mental residue. The mind feels clearer not because it is empty, but because it is efficient. What passes through does not accumulate. There can be moments where you sense the environment, responding differently to your presence. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle synchronizations. Timing aligns. Friction decreases. This is not cause and effect in a linear sense. It is resonance. When the system is coherent, it meets coherence more easily. You are not trying to maintain this. Maintenance would imply effort. What you are doing now is allowing the default state to reveal itself more fully. The default was always here, obscured by noise and demand. As those recede, what remains feels familiar, almost ordinary. Ordinariness here is not dullness, it is reliability. You can rely on awareness to stay present without supervision. You can rely on the body to signal what it needs. You can rely on stillness to return on its own after movement. This reliability reduces the impulse to manage experience. Nothing needs to be protected. Nothing needs to be extended. The system continues to function within its natural parameters, adjusting as needed without commentary. Recognition deepens not by adding insight, but by removing interference. You remain where you are, not because you decided to stay, but because there is no longer a reason to leave. You may begin to notice that even recognition itself feels quieter now. There is less emphasis on noticing that you are noticing. Awareness does not turn back on itself as often. This is not a loss of clarity. It is a sign that self-reference is no longer required to maintain stability. The system is operating without commentary. Experience unfolds without needing to be framed. Sensations, thoughts, and movements arise in the same field and dissolve without leaving traces that demand attention. Nothing needs to be marked as important. Importance used to function as a sorting mechanism when capacity felt limited. Capacity no longer feels limited. There is a softness in how the observer relates to the world at this point. Not softness as vulnerability, but softness as permeability. You are not rigidly separated from what surrounds you, nor are you merged into it. Interaction happens without friction. Boundaries are clear, but not defended. You might notice that silence now feels fuller than sound. Not because sound is unwelcome, but because silence carries more information. In silence, subtle patterns become detectable without effort. Timing, tone, and direction register before they are named. This is not intuition as a special faculty. It is perception without interference. There can be moments where nothing in particular holds your attention, and this feels entirely sufficient. You are not bored. You are not waiting. Awareness rests without an object. This is often unfamiliar because attention is usually trained to attach itself to something. Here, attachment is unnecessary. Presence sustains itself. You may also notice that emotional states move more freely. When something arises, it completes its cycle without obstruction. There is less suppression and less indulgence. Emotion does not become an identity or a problem to solve. It is simply part of the field's movement. The sense of a personal timeline continues to soften. Past and future do not disappear, but they no longer exert gravitational pull. They are accessible when needed and irrelevant when not. This makes the present moment feel less like a narrow slice and more like a stable platform. At times, you might recognize how much effort used to go into maintaining a sense of continuity, remembering who you were, projecting who you should be, reconciling discrepancies. That effort is largely absent now. Continuity is felt rather than constructed. You know yourself without rehearsing a story. There is also a change in how you experience meaning. Meaning is no longer something you extract from experience. It is something that occasionally appears on its own and just as easily disappears. You do not cling to it. You do not feel diminished when it is absent. The moment does not require it to be complete. You may sense a deeper trust in the system's capacity to respond appropriately without pre-planning. This trust is not optimistic, it is empirical. You have felt the accuracy of spontaneous response enough times that anticipation feels unnecessary. When something needs attention, attention arrives. Stillness here is not something you return to. It is the background against which all movement happens. Even when activity increases, the background does not recede. This creates a sense of depth rather than intensity. Life feels layered, not overwhelming. You might also notice that your internal posture toward uncertainty has shifted again. Not just tolerance, but ease. Uncertainty is no longer an open loop demanding closure. It is simply unformed information. The system does not rush to complete it. As this stabilizes, there is less interest in describing or sharing the experience, not out of secrecy, but out of sufficiency. Description feels redundant. The experience does not need reinforcement through language. It stands on its own. Nothing here signals arrival or completion. There is no sense of having reached a point that must be maintained. What is present continues to be present because it is natural. The system is no longer organizing itself around progress. It is simply functioning coherently, moment by moment, without requiring acknowledgement. By now, even the idea of a process may feel distant. What remains does not present itself as something unfolding. It feels more like something steady that was always in place, now unobstructed. You are not inside an experience that is moving forward. You are resting within a field that does not need direction to remain intact. Awareness no longer checks for confirmation. There is nothing to verify. The absence of doubt here is not certainty, it is irrelevance. Doubt required a reference point that no longer organizes perception. Without that reference, the question simply does not arise. You may notice that your relationship with effort has changed at a fundamental level. Effort is no longer opposed to ease. When action occurs, it is clean. When rest occurs, it is complete. There is no internal negotiation between the two. The system does not debate its own state. This can feel strangely ordinary. Not transcendent, not dramatic, just clear. The clarity is not sharp, it is diffuse and even. Nothing stands out as especially significant, and yet nothing feels out of place. This is what coherence feels like when it is not being contrasted against chaos. You might sense that attention has become less personal. Thoughts still reference memory, sensation still registers in the body, but the ownership of experience feels lighter. Experience happens, but it does not need to belong to a narrative. You are not stepping away from life. You are stepping out of commentary about it. There is also a noticeable reduction in internal resistance to whatever is present. Even discomfort, if it arises, does not feel like an interruption. It is included without protest. The system no longer attempts to optimize the moment. Optimization implied dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction has loosened its hold. You may find that stillness now carries a sense of quiet authority. Not authority over anything, but authority as stability. It does not persuade, it does not assert, it simply remains. This presence influences experience without directing it, much like gravity shapes movement without instruction. At times, you might recognize how much of your earlier orientation depended on contrast. High and low, clear and unclear, meaningful and empty. Those contrasts have softened. This does not flatten experience, it smooths it. Variation still exists, but it does not fragment awareness. The observer now feels less like a point and more like a condition. Not something that looks, but something that allows looking to occur. This shift is subtle, almost invisible. It does not announce itself because it does not need recognition to function. You may notice that even silence has changed. It is no longer something you enter when activity stops. It is present even as activity continues. This makes movement feel quieter, less invasive. Life does not intrude on stillness, it moves within it. There is also a sense that nothing is being accumulated. Experience does not pile up. Each moment completes itself and leaves no residue. Memory is available, but it does not weigh on the present. Anticipation may appear, but it does not pull you forward. This creates a feeling of lightness that is not energetic or euphoric. It is structural. The system is carrying less unnecessary load. What remains is sufficient to respond, to feel, to notice. Nothing extra is being held in reserve. You are not waiting for anything to finalize. There is no threshold ahead that needs to be crossed. The idea of arrival does not fit here. What is present does not resolve into a conclusion. It remains open without being unfinished. As this steadiness continues, there is a quiet sense of alignment that does not need reinforcement. You do not need to remind yourself of it. You do not need to protect it. It is self-sustaining because it is not being manipulated. What remains now is simple. Awareness resting as itself. Experience moving through without friction. No urgency, no demand, no commentary required. This does not signal an ending. It is merely the condition from which whatever continues will do so naturally, without announcement. There is nothing left here that needs to settle. What is present has already found its natural position. Awareness rests without leaning forward or pulling back. It does not monitor itself. It does not wait for confirmation. It simply remains available, steady, and clear. You may notice that even the sense of listening has softened. Words arrive and pass, but they do not ask to be held. Meaning does not need to be extracted. Recognition happens, if it happens at all, without effort. Silence carries as much presence as sound, and neither interrupts the other. The body continues to breathe without instruction. Sensation moves through without being labeled. Thought may arise, but it does not organize the moment. The system knows how to function without supervision. This knowing is not conceptual. It is felt as ease. Stillness here is not dramatic. It does not deepen or expand. It remains consistent, like a stable surface beneath everything that moves. You are not inside it. You are not separate from it. The distinction is unnecessary. What matters is that nothing is required to maintain it. There is no sense of holding on. Nothing feels fragile. Even if attention shifts, the background does not disappear. It does not need to be returned to. It has never left. Movement happens within it and resolves back into it naturally. You might notice how little effort it takes now to simply be where you are. There is no internal posture to maintain, no stance to defend. Experience unfolds without resistance, and when resistance appears, it is noticed without becoming a problem. The system adjusts without drama. Time feels less like a sequence and more like a gentle flow. Moments do not stack. They arrive, complete themselves, and leave space behind. Nothing accumulates. Nothing presses forward. The present does not feel narrow or fleeting. It feels sufficient. There is no instruction embedded here, no guidance to follow. Nothing is being asked of you. The absence of demand is not emptiness. It is stability. When nothing is required, awareness can rest as itself without distraction. You are not being directed toward an outcome. Outcomes belong to effort. What is present now does not need to become anything else. It does not improve or degrade. It remains coherent by not being interfered with. If attention drifts, it drifts within the same quiet field. If sound increases, it rises and falls within the same stillness. If thought returns, it appears and dissolves without pulling you away. Nothing here competes for control. This is not a conclusion. There is no sense of closing or finishing. What remains does not resolve into an endpoint. It simply continues as it is, without needing to be marked. You are free to remain with this, or to move on, without carrying anything with you. Nothing needs to be remembered. Nothing needs to be applied. The system already knows how to return to this condition on its own. For now, there is only this quiet recognition, awareness resting without urgency, stillness present without effort, and nothing else required for coherence to remain exactly as it is.